Welcome to the Blue Security Podcast, a weekly podcast for information security defenders, where we bring you discussions on best practices, tools, and implementation for enterprise security. Now, here are your hosts for today's show, Andy Jha and Adam Brewer.
Welcome to this week's episode of the Blue Security Podcast. I'm Andy, your host.
I'm Adam, your co-host.
Coming to you on a beautiful Memorial Day weekend, we are going to talk about Microsoft Build. Build happened last week, and this is a developer-focused conference that Microsoft puts on for our employees, for developers, for external folks. You can sign in and watch all of the episodes that are recorded and on demand. But we are going to bring you Adam and Andy's recap of what we think are some of the interesting highlights that we found throughout the conference.
Absolutely. And before we get into it, I'd say outside of a specific topic, the staging of how Build itself was held was interesting in that Microsoft has essentially two major public-facing conferences, three if you count Inspire, but two are Build, which is the developers conference, and Ignite, which is the IT professionals conference. And then Inspire is the Microsoft Partners Conference, essentially. And then we used to have an internal one called Ready as well. And we had Ignite last fall with a bit of an in-person component to it. And that was held in Seattle at what used to be known as the Washington State Convention Center. Now it's the Seattle Convention Center, but the older one there, actually on Pike Street. And it was still like all of the keynotes were pre-recorded. They were played live there for the audience to watch. But my understanding from folks who attended is that it was kind of dipping a toe in the water of an in-person event. Well, Build this week was also held at the Seattle Convention Center, although the new building that was just completed kind of catty-corner from the existing complex. And by all accounts, it was an awesome in-person event. And I was surprised because I kind of expected it to be like how Apple is doing their developers conference, Worldwide Developers Conference, in the coming weeks, where they're hosting kind of a small event at Apple Park in Cupertino, but they're going to watch the keynote, and Apple's even set up front. It's going to be pre-recorded. So I was actually surprised. I expected us to do the same thing, but I pull up the keynote and there's Satya striding out live on stage. I haven't seen Satya deliver a live keynote now in almost 4 years. So even for me as a Microsoft employee, like, it was really different and honestly refreshing, because the way in-person like keynotes are delivered or presentations are delivered, to me, is more compatible with my brain than like overly edited. And it's ironic because our podcast is pretty tightly edited, but overly edited kind of video, essentially infomercials that are really tightly edited and chopped together, and nobody says or ah or says anything other than talks perfectly fluently. Well, that's not reality. And so to me, I watched both keynotes. There's about 2 hours each day, and I found it so much easier to just listen to and ingest and then understand than some of the pre-recorded formats. So I was really excited to see this. I did not get to go to Seattle and attend in person. It's really not in scope for my role. But really, really, really enjoyed seeing an in-person event again and see people speaking extemporaneously on stage. That was really nice. And something I'd honestly missed. And to give credit, I know a lot of Google I/O recently was also live on stage, extemporaneous as well. So it looks like at this point, Apple is potentially the laggard in this space, and they may just like their slickly produced Apple Park zoomy videos anyway, because they can pack more information in. But for me, I really appreciated the approach and was honestly just thrilled to see like our executives take the stage in a live format. I really like seeing that.
Yeah, absolutely. And AI was definitely the central focus for
star of the show.
the entire conference. It was the theme. And Adam and I, we talked about ChatGPT last week. And ironically, one of the things that we had talked about towards the end of the show was how Bing has a new chat feature and that it implements the Chat GPT or the GPT-4 engine on the back end. However, it also has the ability to cite its sources because it is an internet search, and ChatGPT didn't have that. Well, one of the things that they announced at the conference right up front in the keynote is that ChatGPT now will integrate with Bing. And so the answers that are in ChatGPT, which is a separate solution, if you want to call it, because Bing is the public search engine, which is available with just a Microsoft account. And ChatGPT, while you can use an account, but there's also a subscriber model. These answers now, when you're asking ChatGPT, are grounded by the Bing search on the back end, the web data, and will also include citations so that the users can go and click on the links, and then it'll launch in a web page and you can start learning more. And that will start rolling out for the subscribers as soon as that announcement was made. And it will also be free to users by simply enabling a plugin. So that was really cool. There's also some collaboration with OpenAI that Microsoft is doing. The same open plugin standard that OpenAI uses for ChatGPT will be enabled across ChatGPT and the breadth of Microsoft's Copilot offerings, which is Microsoft's brand for all of the AI-driven natural language solution that's going to be integrated with pretty much everything that we have across the board. There was a lot of Copilot announcements that we'll get into later on through the show. But yeah, the open plugin standard will be built in. And that just means that developers and users that want to use their own plugins with the AI app built on the OpenAI service will be just interoperable within the whole standard. So a lot of collaboration. We've mentioned it before, but Microsoft has a stake in OpenAI. We're not the owners of OpenAI, but we've heavily invested in that company, and OpenAI is the owners of ChatGPT. And so that's how that relationship works. We have a 49% stake within OpenAI, and obviously have a good partnership going on. And we always mention on the show, just in case there are some new listeners, Adam and I are Microsoft employees. This show is not sponsored by Microsoft, but they are our employers. So anyways, that was a bit on the AI. Any thoughts on that, Adam?
AI was certainly the theme, overarching theme of all the keynotes, and was pretty much infused in everything. You know, I've been at Microsoft now a little over 6 years, and Microsoft had really started to pivot its culture before I arrived. In fact, that's what made it attractive to me as a place to work. But still, sometimes you take pause and you kind of notice, like, oh my gosh, like this is so different than the Microsoft of old, where we're talking about we're going to align to the public standard. We're going to align to the open standard. And so that as a developer, if you want to develop a plugin for ChatGPT, you can reuse that same code and everything, and that can become a plugin for Microsoft 365 Copilot, for Bing Chat, just as easily. And that used to be, there was a time when that would not have been a thing, you know? So I thought that was pretty cool. And the whole concept of plugins, I think, is really fascinating, because if you think of, and when Satya gave his keynote, he kind of referenced these major leaps along the history of computing, right? Talking about, for example, the Palo Alto Research Center, Xerox PARC, their first graphical user interface they created that inspired Steve Jobs to create the Lisa and later the Macintosh. He kind of called that out, and he actually called out the iPhone, which I thought was wild to see. And then, of course, kind of suggesting AI is the next big thing. Well, if you think about like the hype around the original iPhone launch in June 2007, And even though it had a litany of features that it didn't do compared to other, maybe more legacy smartphone platforms, like it didn't do cut, copy, and paste at first. It didn't record video at first. But what it did do was really very impressive, and you could see the potential. And especially like in having a desktop class browser was this monumental leap forward. Well, I think as interesting as large language models are at doing things like prompting you to like create new content or helping you summarize content or restate content, I think where they get really interesting, to take that analogy further, if you think of how the launch of the App Store 1 year later in June, July 2008 really was the smart of the smartphone revolution, the gold rush there. Maybe plugins are a similar thing for these large language models. Like the initial introduction was, wow, this is a cool thing. I can imagine a lot of what we can do with it. But ultimately, as we've kind of pointed out on the show, they're just really good at generating English like content. But when it starts to go to the next level is, as opposed to saying, oh, here's this restaurant, they serve this kind of food, and here's their number to make reservations, when it's, I'm integrated with OpenTable and I can help you make a reservation for 2 at 7 o'clock tonight. Does that sound good? That's like next level stuff. And some of the demos they were showing, some of them were like in a business context, like I need to create a ticket. Okay. I'll create a Jira ticket for this and then pull this content from SharePoint and then go look this up in Thomson Reuters, like Westlaw citation, and throw that in there. Like that was really like crazy mind-blowing stuff. And so to use that analogy, I see like the launch of ChatGPT late last year, that was like comparable to maybe the launch of the iPhone, but it didn't really recognize its full power until you had the launch of the open plugin model, here 6-9 months later. And that's similar to the iPhone, where the following year launched the App Store. And that's what really set it on that trajectory. So to me, these plugins and what they're capable of doing, I am very curious to follow that story more, because I think that's where these things go from really good at generating English language to helping you accomplish a task, and maybe even stitching multiple workloads together, because those were a lot of the samples we saw. We're taking 2 or 3 disparate plugins and just naturally making a workflow. And to me, where I'm going to have the hardest time with this is retraining my brain for what's possible, because I'm used to thinking like, well, computers can't do that. So you're going to have to go do this yourself, and then they can help you with that step, but then you're going to have to do this. And like, you almost have to dumb it down and just see what it's possible, because it's kind of amazing the breadth and depth of what could be. And so this is possibly that next developer gold rush here. In fact, it probably is. But this is that opportunity. And how cool is it that the work you do to work with ChatGPT, you get access to all of the Microsoft Enterprise Copilots as well, when and where that makes sense to extend your plugin even further.
All good over there?
Yeah.
Okay.
What?
It looked like your screen flashed or something.
Oh, my other screen turned on. Yeah, I just turned it back off.
Okay, so this is a security podcast. So let's talk about some of the security things that we thought were interesting that were announced at the conference. The first thing that I want to talk about is Win32 app isolation, because this, as soon as I saw the title, I was immediately intrigued and I had to know more. So when I watched this Q&A, which of course will have a link in the show notes, and I do recommend, if you're interested, to go and watch it. It is extremely technical. Again, this was a developer conference, so a lot of the APIs and libraries and how the sauce is made behind the scenes, this is the session that talks about that. But from a high level, I'll kind of talk about it. And really, right now we have ways to control applications by reputation, essentially the ability to block an untrusted app. This new layered approach to modernizing Win32 app security and privacy as well is running a Win32 application in isolation. Number one, obviously, if you're running it in isolation, you can prevent any type of malware from spreading from that application. For the sake of argument, I'm not going to get into a technical debate on the difference between isolation and sandboxing. For the purpose of this discussion, we'll consider them the same thing. So we're talking about sandboxing Win32 applications. And now Microsoft has provided a way for developers to do that. The way that I pictured how this works is essentially taking the idea of how apps run on smartphones and moving that to a PC. So on an iPhone, on an Android phone, apps run in a sandbox. They don't really have permission outside of the application into the operating system unless you provide them with that permission. And so like on the iPhone, like on an Android smartphone, when you launch an app, it'll ask you, can I have access to your location? Can I have access to the camera? Can I have access to your contacts? Because it runs at a lower permission, a lower privilege than your user that is signed in. That's not the case with PC apps today. PC apps today, when you launch them, they have the same privilege as your user for the most part. So it can access things that your signed in user can access. Well, this app isolation will lower that privilege so that any app that's running in isolation will have to request permission, and you'll know as a user what you're granting permission to. So not only privacy, but also security. The app isolation is in public preview for developers to start using on existing applications if they want to update, or on new applications. So that was the first one. And of course, that's a huge one. And then the second one that for security is that Entra External ID is now in public preview. And that is a way for any application to integrate with Microsoft Entra Verified ID using the new Entra Verified ID SDK. And we've talked about Verified ID a little bit on the show, but it is an open standards-based verifiable credential service that anyone with an Azure AD subscription, including the Azure AD free, can use at no additional cost to automate the verification of identification or issue verification. And yeah, I mean, you can essentially empower your users to take ownership of their digital credentials because it's a decentralized model. So it's a really different way of thinking about how identity works, because users can take those credentials with them, and you can verify credentials from places that have issued these verifiable credentials. But now this external ID is in public preview for developers to start integrating with applications as well.
So we talked a little bit in the pre-show about the Win32 app isolation. Obviously a great thing, especially if you can be an existing Win32 app developer and you can add these capabilities. Not that many native Win32 apps anymore, at least not as much Windows app development as there used to be. But hopefully all the major vendors that are still making these apps can embrace this model. It just ups the security game for everyone. And, you're not going to get 100% compliance or anything like that. But if you look over on the Mac side, Apple has been trying to do app sandboxing for many years now in line with that iOS model. And it's not a requirement. They kind of have a carrot model for it. I think there's some benefits you get if you embrace app sandboxing. I think you have to do it to be on the App Store. But on the Mac, you do not have to be on the Mac App Store. Macs still support loading apps through other means. They're not like iOS devices. So I mean, it's a good thing, right? I think that model has been very successful on mobile devices on the whole. And so this would be exciting to see. So certainly a very in-depth technical session to learn more. And the Entra external ID, the other thing about this is this kind of unifies, if you've done any of this in the past with like Azure AD B2C and B2B. And one of the confusing things about that is, even though they're one letter of difference, they're entirely different things. And Microsoft has unified the billing model for those two like a year or two ago. So you can pay for all your external identities in one fell swoop. This is kind of taking that a step further as well, where we're building a more centralized platform for managing anyone external from your organization to give them the access they need to do the thing they need to do. If they're a consumer of your product, help them maybe sign on and pay their bill or order food from your company, as well as do things like maybe collaborate internally as more of a business to business relationship. So definitely something to check out there as well, because this is honestly a great thing to simplify that model. Because as somebody who has been responsible for both technologies in the past, the story was pretty confusing. And there are major people using like Azure AD B2C today. I know Culver's, hey, Wisconsin, their online ordering platform is based on Azure AD B2C. Also my electric company and gas company, Mid-American Energy, shout out Warren Buffett. They use Azure AD B2C for me to sign on and pay my bill and all that. So definitely something you've probably interact with in your day-to-day life. And this is going to make that easier for companies to implement and manage. And if you're doing anything with that, worth checking out as well. And then I'll add one additional thing, Andy, I think from a security perspective is interesting. The announcements around Windows Dev Home, I thought were really compelling, because although security defenders oftentimes aren't necessarily like developers in the sense that you're not cranking out code all day, you may be cranking out scripts. You may do a lot from the command line. You may like working with terminal and PowerShell scripts and a lot of the similar workflows to developers. Well, if you didn't see in the keynote the announcement of Windows Dev Home, it's this opportunity to basically spin up an entire development environment on your Windows PC almost out of the box and take care of all the things like installing all the command line tools, the Windows subsystem for Linux. And the stated goal was, and I think this is a good goal, is make Windows the best place for developers to work. They might not be developing Windows apps. They might be developing AI plugins or web apps, or maybe they're security defenders writing new scripts, but creating the best environment for that. That's the stated goal. And it's something that's starting to ship in public preview as well. So it's a way to kind of get all that plumbing and scaffolding stood up, which is, if you've tried to do it, is kind of a pain, right? You've got to install Git, and then you've got to install Python, and you've got to install this and that and Chocolatey, and like it just does all the things and gets you ready to go. I thought it looked really slick. I have not played with it myself, but I know a lot of security defenders today, they use Mac OS because Mac OS has great terminal support, great scripting support, great command line support. And this is where now Windows, where you can not only have access to the breadth and depth of Windows applications, but also anything that runs in Linux side by side there, that becomes really compelling. And so I think that's a clever move, again, on our Windows team's part, on trying to position Windows as, hey, let's make this an enthusiast platform where people who live in those kind of tools all day have a great place to get their work done. Like if you haven't checked out Windows Terminal in a while, it's amazing. Like Kayla Cinnamon and team have done a great job with that. So some really cool stuff there to check out as well. Windows Dev Home, I think, is kind of related. Again, even if you're not a developer, you may find value in it.
Awesome. Great call out there, Adam. Let's talk about some of the productivity things that were announced at Build. First and foremost is Windows. They announced Windows Copilot. And of course, even for me, I work at Microsoft. I have trouble keeping up with the pace of innovation that we are just tackling all of these different AI products and coming out with. I am amazed that they're able to just integrate something like this into Windows right away. And this is very similar to a lot of the other Copilot solutions or products or whatever you want to call them that have been announced, but it's for Windows. And unlike some of the other ones that have been announced, correct me if I'm wrong, Adam, but I didn't see any licensing requirement for Windows Copilot. I believe this is going to be available for consumers on Windows 11.
Yeah, we didn't say, so, always with a grain of salt with us, and we don't know anyways, obviously. Go listen to last week's show and hear how hilariously outdated it was by the time build rolled around. But the most of the demo on Windows Copilot, which was part of Satya Nadella's kickoff keynote, and then Panos Panay showed it again as part of his Windows keynote, was mostly consumer focused. I'd say of the different demos they showed, about the only one in it that I think was really enterprise specific was like sending a file to a Teams chat or sending an image to a Teams chat. Otherwise, it was more like integration with Spotify, integration with Adobe products, like nothing that screams enterprise to me. So I think although we didn't say anything, the vibe was that this is more of a consumer focused offering. Not that you can't benefit from it in the enterprise, but that's to be announced for sure.
Right. And so, like Adam gave a couple examples, other ones were like changing a setting within Windows, like going to the dark mode or opening an app, bringing Bing Chat to a sidebar that you can pin within Windows. And, just being able to ask a question in normal language to a computer, to a chat, to do something, instead of having to launch a browser and ask a search engine and then reading screenshots and an article. You can just say, please change my background to this photo, or please change this setting. I need to change my DNS setting, whatever it is. I'm sure this new Copilot that's integrated with Windows will be able to do it. So that was pretty cool. And that's going to be available in preview for Windows 11. I've also heard if you're on like the early, releases of Windows, that it might be available already, depending on how far in advance you go on your preview builds, but it'll be coming out pretty soon for people to try out.
Yeah, I this one surprised me for sure. And if you think back to in like the great computing history we've gone through, back in the Mac OS 10, it was either Panther or Tiger, but when Apple announced Spotlight, and Spotlight was this thing, it still exists on the Mac. There's a magnifying glass in kind of the upper right of the UI, and you click it and you just get a search field, and you can type anything in it, and it's super quick and super responsive. And famously, like, Bill Gates blew a gasket when he saw this and like, why don't we have this? And I think too, this is a potential counterpunch. It'll be exciting to see what gets announced at Worldwide Developers Conference from Apple, see what they have maybe up their sleeve as far as AI goes. But this kind of leaps that, right? Where now you can ask natural language questions about like, how do I turn on dark mode? Hey, send this file to this person in Microsoft Teams. Launch this playlist in Spotify. That's really compelling. And that kind of takes that search for anything here to the next level of command anything here, and I'll help you do it, or at least tell you where it is, if nothing else. And to be fair, a lot of it was in line. It was contextual. So you'll have to go check out the demo again. Satya's keynote, Panos Panay's keynote, both had it. But there was an example where I think the user asked something like, how can I be more productive? And it made two suggestions. It said, turn on dark mode and use like the focus assist feature. It actually had a button in line to the chat that you could click on, and immediately, like, you click the button and boom, dark mode was on. Like, that's really cool, especially when sometimes it's confusing, like where stuff is buried in the settings app, because there's just so much there that I can ask naturally, like, hey, I want to do this thing. And it will tell you, oh yeah, I can do that for you. Just tell me, click here to have me do it. Like, that's pretty game changing. And honestly, amongst all these Copilots, that's the one I least expected, was one getting added to Windows, but it does make sense. And it will be a button on your taskbar, and you click it, and a sidebar comes over. And the other thing too to note is that the UI of almost all of these Copilots is very, very similar. And I'm sure that's intentional and by design, but it's very comforting that wherever you are, whatever context you're in, Copilot looks the same. It's a pane that slides over. It's a chat-like interface. It has very similar design. And so this Windows Copilot as well looks similar to what we've seen from other Copilots like M365 Copilot or Bing Chat. It looks similar to those.
Yeah. And another announcement that was made was M365 Copilot, which is currently in private preview, will be also natively integrated into Microsoft Edge via the Edge sidebar. So if you're an Edge user, you'll notice that there's this sidebar now that has been added. There's mixed feelings about it. I also have some mixed feelings about it because I feel like Edge is getting a little bit bloated with all these different things, but it makes sense for people who operate almost strictly within the browser. Like, there are many people that basically when they go to a computer, the only application that they use is the browser. And so I think it makes sense for a lot of those folks. It's not for me, but it does have quite a few new capabilities and plugins that are going to be coming. And the Microsoft 365 Copilot, which is going to be integrated with Edge, is the one that will be available for Teams. It'll be available for M365, but it does require that enterprise licensing. You have to have a work account for it. Again, that's in private preview. It'll be coming out shortly. And then another thing, this is security and productivity related, was that something called Edge for Business was announced. It's currently in preview. This is what Microsoft is going to be calling Edge, with the enterprise controls, security, and productivity features for users within an enterprise. It's planned to be the standard browser experience for organizations, and you will be required to use an Azure AD sign-in. If you are in security, and I mean IT in general, there's a benefit in controlling and standardizing your browser experience, making sure that you have the home page and the search and what extensions can be installed. All that can be, number one, again, good for productivity, good for standardization, but also good for security. And so this new dedicated Edge experience will help you, reduce the surface attack of cyber attacks, or surface area of cyber attacks. And you'll be able to, keep the users separate from their work and personal accounts, and the data, will be syncing with different places. So I think some of the stuff we already have, but the brand now, this is really kind of a branding thing, and I'm sure there's going to be additional features that are coming out, but this Edge for Business is going to be this new terminology for the enterprise controlled Edge.
We did a show in the past, and it was quite a while ago, and we've talked about this maybe in more than one show, where number one, we articulated that using an enterprise controlled identity for your browser makes a lot of sense. Well, that's Edge. And I think we've also talked about having a browser you're able to keep up to date and maintain security updates is critical, because it's potentially one of the riskiest apps in the whole enterprise. So from a security professional perspective, I think Edge makes sense. It's standardizing in your environment, having your users sign in with their corporate credentials, managing sync and all of those beneficial features, but under your watchful eye, is the right approach. You don't want people signing into a Google account or not offering those sorts of features like synchronization, because we did a show about operational excellence inspired by a Swift on Security tweet, talking about that if you can't completely rebuild a PC in 30, 40 minutes from scratch, then you're going to have issues if you run into some sort of security incident or other operational challenge. And so it's just good practice to be able to do that. Well, browser sync's one of those things. Like if your posture is, we use Chrome and we just don't let people sign in with your Google account. Okay, so what you're telling me is I basically am hosed if I lose my Chrome. I'm going to have to set it up all over again. That's not good from a operational excellence perspective. So, this is something I think worth looking at. And I think the Edge for Business brand helps encourage businesses to be like, we should take a look at this. We should consider standardizing here because it just makes sense. And I think from our listeners' perspective of you want the best and most secure environment, but you want to enable productivity, then this is definitely the right approach too. Because if you don't offer something, and this is like the horse is dead, I get it, but people are going to find ways around it, right? So offer the capabilities users expect today. And guess what? Users expect and almost demand that their browser environment is synchronized across all devices. That's table stakes. If you're not doing that because you're standardizing Chrome and we disable Google sign-in, then you're behind the times, man. Or man or woman. So get with it. Anyhow, side note tangent there, but this is interesting. When we were talking about this in the pre-show, Andy brought it up and I said, I didn't hear about that. So I had missed this announcement myself.
One fun thing that I found was for Microsoft 365, avatars for Microsoft Teams will now be generally available for M365 Business Enterprise licenses starting this week in the Teams desktop app on Windows and Mac. This was something that I've had access to for a while because I've had the dog food edition for Teams, and it is nice. I think at first it was a little bit of a novelty. It may have worn off, but I think it has its place. Avatars is essentially a way to give a visual of a person and give that person a break from the camera while you're still kind of able to be engaging. And so there's gestures that you can do from your avatar, like react to what someone is saying, and it'll give that impression that you're still there and engaging as well. So I like using it. If I'm having like a bad hair day and I don't want to be on camera, I can use the avatar. And it gives you the opportunity to shape how you want to present yourself in a meeting, which I think is important in these times, right? Like sometimes there's stuff going on, privacy issues. You still want to be on camera and you still want to feel engaging, but you just don't want to turn on your camera live. So give it a try. I think it definitely has its place and it can be fun.
If you think maybe one good thing that came out of the COVID-19 pandemic was that it normalized, until it became politicized, but maybe still at least somewhat normalized, the wearing of like a face mask when you're not feeling well, or you're going to get on an airplane or something. Like, it's more socially acceptable than it would have been in the past, where, you would have really gotten looked at kind of weird, like in 2018. And now, again, some people might look at you weird for different reasons, but for the most part, I think it's fairly socially acceptable. Nobody's going to really give you grief over it. I feel like this is like that, where it hasn't yet been normalized, but it's a potentially helpful thing for mental and physical well-being. Being on camera all day is exhausting. It is not equivalent to face-to-face meetings by any stretch of the imagination, no matter how much people wished it was. And so I don't turn on my camera. I'm very rare about doing it during the workday, just because honestly, I don't want to. If I'm in like a one-on-one call with somebody and I know they always turn their camera on, then I generally will. So like they're not talking to themselves, but I just generally don't, because I don't like it. I don't like being concerned with what I'm doing or if I'm making a face or whatever. I've tried using the avatars internally and they've gotten kind of a nice, response, although it's mostly been, that's a novelty, like Andy said. I don't know if I've used it on a customer call yet. For the longest time, we weren't allowed to, by the way. We've had access to this, but we were told to only use it internally. I would like to see this become normalized. I would like to see this become acceptable, because one of the unfortunate downsides about the UI of products like Teams is that, and this is one of those, like, this is not a knock on Teams dev group, by the way. I think this is a difficult problem to solve. If, let's say, I'm in a chat and like 3 or 4 people have their cameras on and like me, number 5 and number 6 person don't, The UI just shows like the four, the Brady Bunch view of the four people with their cameras on, and we don't get a representation anymore. There isn't that black square with an AB in the middle of it, as an example. Well, that would be kind of wasteful for the people who are on camera to waste a box with a black square. So the design is to not show that, but it does make you kind of invisible. If somebody's looking at that screen of who's here and you're not there, then you're not participating in some people's minds. And while again, that might also be a short-sighted perspective, we're all human. I mean, we're trained to do that. Like what we can physically see is who's present. And so this is a good intermediate. It's honestly, it's fun. And I found myself like using the reactions more when I was using the avatar because I wasn't so concerned with like my on-camera presence. So I was able to, have some fun with it, but also like react appropriately. Somebody announced something good and give it an applause or a thumbs up. I like it. So I want to see this get normalized. My fear is that this is going to be seen as weird or playful or not, business appropriate, and it's not going to catch on. I hope that's not the case because I see the benefits. I liked using it when I've used it. But I see the challenges, the uphill adoption it may have in getting adopted. So, you know what? Challenge to our listeners, go be that trailblazer. Be the person to use your avatar and stand up for avatar rights because no one wants to be on camera all of the time. It's mentally draining. So I like this solution, but I'm also, I don't know about pessimistic, but maybe 50-50 on whether we'll see it take off or maybe not.
Yeah. Okay, finally, let's talk about Azure. Azure is one of those things that there's always a ton of announcements. There were things on Cosmos DBs and SQL databases and data and infrastructure. But the thing that stood out to me, being a security person, was this new announcement of Azure Confidential Computing. So there's these new computing, new confidential virtual machines that are based on Intel's 4th generation Xenon processors with TDX technology. And I had to go look this up because I'm like, what is TDX technology? Well, it's an Intel marketing term that represents their trust domain extension technology. And that's architectural elements that help deploy hardware isolated virtual machines called trust domains. Now, the Intel TDX is designed to isolate these VMs from virtual machine managers / hypervisors and any other non-trust domain software on the platform to protect these TDs from a broad range of software. So really interesting because you're actually isolating it from the thing that most people use to manage it, but there are use cases for them. We wouldn't have come out with something like this if I'm sure our customers haven't been asking for them. So there'll be ways to migrate sensitive workloads, both from other cloud architecture to or on-prem infrastructure to these sensitive confidential VMs. And customers that are in highly regulated industries like banking, healthcare, public sector, those are the ones I think that might want to take advantage of something like this. The VMs also include guest attestation that can be used to ensure that the VMs will only boot when the platform verifies that the VM host environment is chained to the Intel hardware root of trust and customized secure key policies have been met. So really cool stuff. On a side note, I remember this conversation that I had with a customer who had asked me, does Azure have, CIS server benchmark secure VMs? And I was like, I don't know. I have to go check on that. And coincidentally, I went and looked because when I stand up VMs, I just look at the Windows 11 or the Windows Server image. But if you actually go and search, there's actually a ton of different images that are there. And like one of them in this case was the CIS benchmark, which is an image that was hardened based on the CIS benchmarks. So they had this pre-stuff. And if you wanted to use this image for your server, you can. But of course, there's a small computing fee that you're paying to CIS for providing that hardened image. So, side note, like there are all these different ways to harden your operating systems, but now this is hardware-based hardening. So this is not necessarily a hardened image. This is a virtual machine that is hardware isolated from the hypervisor and other, software to protect these so-called trust domains. So really cool stuff, I think, if you're in the business that you need this sort of, confidential computing, definitely take a look at it.
Confidential computing is something I think we should do a show about, mostly for my own purposes of learning more, because I'm very ignorant as to this stuff. It's very interesting to me. I've had a couple of customers ask me about it. Very interesting customers you may have heard of that do really cool things. But I don't know a lot about it. Everything you just walk through makes sense, like understanding that hardware-based root of trust and creating hardware isolation from the hypervisor, ensuring the confidentiality of the compute that's happening in like a multi-tenant environment. That all makes sense conceptually. And I can think of regulations where you need to be able to say, absolutely nobody else can access this, and we can prove it, and here's how. That's what this enables you to do. So like, even if there was, some sort of rogue admin or something, or Satya Nadella decided he wanted to go access something someday, like he couldn't, even if he wanted to, kind of thing. Right. And that's kind of the trust these customers in these regulated industries are looking for. So maybe a future show, confidential computing. I would love to learn more myself, but very cool. And I think the big highlight there is, if this is something you need, it sounds like you can migrate from your existing workloads to these specialty environments without really any change to your code, and with minimal performance impact, which is always ideal. That means that a lift and shift is possible, which we love easy when there's an easy button. So there you go.
And that was our recap of Microsoft Build. Of course, there's going to be a lot more. Take a look at the website. We're going to link the book of news, which is just a high-level overview of a lot of the things that we talked about, but more. And then there's a ton of on-demand sessions that you can go and access by looking it up and watching them. So that's our show for this week. Thanks for watching and listening. As always, our contact information will be in the show notes if you have any questions or future topics you want us to talk about. Thanks, and we'll talk to you guys next week.
Thank you for listening to the Blue Security Podcast. Please check out the show notes, catch up on episodes you may have missed, and subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. Find Andy on Twitter @AJaw0 and Adam @AJ Brewer. See you at our next episode.